Blood spilled across the sunset sky as Bridget Hayes stared out from the weathered porch of her newly inherited ranch house, wondering how she would survive another day in the unforgiving Montana territory of 1876. 6 months had passed since her father's death left her with nothing but debt, a struggling cattle operation, and memories that refused to fade. The ranch hands had all but abandoned her, believing a woman couldn't possibly manage such an enterprise alone. Only old Walter remained, more out of loyalty to her father than faith in her abilities. "Miss Hayes," Walter called from the barn, his voice carrying across the yard. "Rider coming." Bridget's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped against the railing. In these parts, strangers rarely brought good news. She watched as a tall figure on horseback approached, silhouetted against the dying light. The man rode with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in the saddle, his black hat pulled low over his face. "Evening, madam," the stranger called, reining his chestnut mare to a stop several yards from the porch. "Name's Matthew Blackwell. I heard you might be looking for hands." Bridget studied him carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his face weathered by sun and wind. A revolver hung at his hip, but that was nothing unusual for these parts. "Who told you that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Barkeep over in Silver Creek mentioned it, said the Hayes place was short-staffed since." He hesitated. "Since your father passed." Bridget felt the familiar ache at the mention of her father. "I can't afford to pay much," she admitted. Matthew dismounted with fluid grace. Up close, she could see his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "I'm not asking for much, madam, just fair wages for fair work. I've been handling cattle since I could walk." Walter had shuffled over, eyeing the newcomer suspiciously. "We don't know nothing about you, mister." Matthew nodded respectfully to the older man. "That's true, but I can ride, rope, and mend fences better than most." Worked 3 years at the Diamond K up north before they sold out. "Diamond K, huh?" Walter scratched his chin. "Tom Kincaid's outfit?" "Yes, sir. Mr. Kincaid can vouch for me." Bridget was torn. She desperately needed help, but trusting strangers hadn't worked out well for her father. The ranch was all she had left. "You can stay for supper," she finally said. "We'll talk terms after. Walter can show you where to put your horse." "Much obliged." Matthew tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed oddly formal coming from a trail-worn cowboy. Over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Bridget observed Matthew. He ate with good manners but a healthy appetite, complimenting her cooking in a way that seemed genuine rather than flattering. He answered Walter's questions about cattle prices and grazing conditions with knowledge that suggested he was exactly what he claimed to be an experienced ranch hand. "Why'd you leave the Diamond K?" Bridget asked, serving coffee. Matthew's expression darkened slightly. "The new owners and I had different views on how cattle and men should be treated." "That's putting it mildly," Walter interjected. "I heard those Chicago fellas that bought Kincaid out are running their hands ragged and culling half the herd for quick profit." Matthew nodded. "That's about the size of it. Still doesn't explain why you're here," Bridget pressed. "There are bigger outfits than ours hiring. Maybe I prefer working for someone who needs the help, not just someone who can pay the most." His eyes met hers across the table. "I heard about your father, Miss Hayes. He had a reputation as a fair man. I figure his daughter might run things the same way." Bridget felt something inside her soften slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "You'd be working for a woman. Some men have trouble with that." "Can't say as I've tried it before," Matthew said with a hint of a smile, "but I reckon if you know your business, that's all that matters." After supper, Bridget laid out the terms: room and board plus modest wages, with the promise of more if the ranch turned a profit. To her surprise, Matthew accepted without hesitation. "One more thing," she added as they concluded their agreement. "I expect loyalty and honesty. If that's a problem, say so now." "No problem at all, Miss Hayes." Matthew studied her face. "If you don't mind me saying, you look like someone carrying a heavy load." "We all have our burdens, Mr. Blackwell. True enough, but I haven't seen you smile once since I arrived." Bridget stiffened. "I don't smile much these days." Something changed in Matthew's expression, a subtle determination that caught her off guard. "Then I'll spend my days trying to change that," he said quietly. She was grateful for the dim light that hid the color rising to her cheeks. "You're here to work, Mr. Blackwell, not to concern yourself with my disposition." "Yes, madam." But there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The next morning, Bridget rose before dawn, as was her habit. To her surprise, Matthew was already in the barn, feeding the horses. "You're up early," she observed. "Sun waits for no man," he replied, hefting a saddle onto the corral fence. Or woman. Together with Walter, they outlined the day's work. The south pasture fence needed mending, cattle needed moving to fresh grazing, and there was always the endless task of checking water sources in the drought-prone landscape. By midday, Bridget found herself revising her initial assessment of Matthew Blackwell. He worked harder than any hand they'd hired before, moving with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience. More surprisingly, he treated her with a respect that acknowledged her position without condescension. Over the next few weeks, Matthew proved his worth beyond question. He rose before dawn and worked until dusk, tackling the most challenging tasks without complaint. Under his care, the horses' coats began to shine, the cattle grew less skittish, and even the dilapidated barn seemed to stand a little straighter. Walter, initially suspicious, had grown to accept the newcomer. "That boy knows his business," he admitted to Bridget one evening as they watched Matthew repair a broken wagon wheel. "Haven't seen work like that since your pa was in his prime." Bridget nodded, though her thoughts were troubled. There was something about Matthew that didn't quite fit. He was educated, she could tell from his speech, when he forgot to maintain the rough cowboy drawl. Sometimes, she caught him staring at the distant mountains with an expression that spoke of secrets and regrets. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, the sunset painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, Bridget found the courage to ask, "Who are you really, Matthew?" He turned to her, surprise evident in his features. "What do you mean? You're no ordinary ranch hand." "Your hands may be calloused, but they're not just from rope and reins." Matthew was quiet for so long that Bridget thought he might not answer, then he sighed. "I was a teacher back east, taught mathematics at a small college in Boston." "How does a mathematics professor end up as a cowboy in Montana territory?" His smile held no humor. "By making poor choices in friends and investments, by trusting the wrong people." He looked down at his hands. "I lost everything, my position, my savings, my reputation, came west to start over." "And the ranch work?" "My uncle had a farm in Pennsylvania. I spent summers there as a boy, the rest I learned along the way." He glanced at her. "Does it matter?" Bridget considered this. "No," she finally said, "as long as you're honest from now on." "I've never lied to you about anything important, Miss Hayes." "Bridget," she said suddenly, "if we're being honest, you might as well use my name." Something warm flickered in his eyes. "Bridget," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. That night, lying in her bed, Bridget replayed their conversation. She'd grown accustomed to Matthew's presence, to the quiet competence with which he approached every task. There was a steadiness to him that she found comforting, but comfort was dangerous. Her father had trusted too easily, and it had cost him everything in the end. The next morning, a letter arrived from the bank in Silver Creek. Bridget read it with mounting dread. The loan her father had taken out was being called in early. They wanted payment in full within 30 days or the ranch would be foreclosed. Matthew found her still sitting at the kitchen table an hour later, the letter crumpled in her fist. "Bad news?" he asked gently. Bridget looked up, too numb to maintain her usual reserve. "The bank. They're calling in my father's loan. We don't have anywhere near enough to pay it." Matthew sat down across from her. "How much do you need?" $2,000, and they want it in 30 days, he whistled softly. "That's a mighty tall order." "It's impossible," Bridget said flatly. "Even if we sold half the herd, we wouldn't get that much in this market. There must be something we can do." Bridget appreciated his use of we, but shook her head. "This isn't your problem, Matthew. I work here. That makes it my problem." He thought for a moment. "What about a cattle drive?" "Prices are better in Cheyenne than they are locally. We'd need more men, and there's no guarantee we'd make it in time. Let me ride into town, see if I can find out why they're calling in the loans so suddenly. Maybe there's room for negotiation." Bridget doubted it, but nodded anyway. She'd tried everything else. Matthew returned from Silver Creek with news that confirmed her worst suspicions. Maxwell Burton, the wealthy rancher whose property bordered hers to the west, had been buying up banknotes all over the territory. He now held her father's loan. "He's land grabbing," Matthew explained, "forcing smaller ranchers out, expanding his empire." "That explains why he offered to buy the ranch for a pittance last month," Bridget said bitterly. "He knew I'd have no choice eventually." "There's always a choice," Matthew insisted. They spent the evening formulating a plan. They would drive the best cattle to Cheyenne for better prices while Walter remained behind to manage the ranch. With luck and fair weather, they might just raise enough to save the Hayes property. The next few days were a flurry of activity. They selected the cattle, plotted their route, and gathered supplies. Walter found 2 more hands willing to join the Drive brothers named Hank and Jesse Sullivan, who had worked for her father years before. The night before their departure, Bridget stood on the porch, doubt gnawing at her resolve. The stars above were brilliant in the clear Montana sky, reminding her of nights when her father would point out constellations and tell her stories of ancient heroes. "Your father would be proud," Matthew's voice came softly from behind her. "Would he?" Bridget turned. "He built this place from nothing. Now I'm about to risk everything on a desperate gamble. Sometimes that's all we have." Matthew moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Desperate gambles and stubborn hope." "Hope," Bridget repeated. "I'm not sure I remember what that feels like." In the silver light of the moon, Matthew's face was cast in shadow, but his eyes caught the starlight. "It feels like possibility," he said quietly. "Like the moment before sunrise when you know the light is coming, even though you can't see it yet." Something stirred in Bridget's chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You have a way with words for a cowboy." "Former mathematics professor," he reminded her with a smile. "Numbers are precise, but sometimes only words can express what matters most." Their gazes held for a long moment. Bridget found herself wondering what it would be like to lean into him, to rest her head against his shoulder and let someone else be strong for a while. Instead, she stepped back. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early." Matthew nodded, though something in his expression suggested he understood what had almost happened between them. "Good night, Bridget." "Good night, Matthew." The cattle drive began at first light. 150 of her best steers headed south, driven by Bridget, Matthew, and the Sullivan brothers. The early days were grueling but uneventful as they established a rhythm: up before dawn, drive until midday heat forced a rest, then push on until dusk. On the 4th night, as they camped beside a stream, Hank Sullivan approached Bridget as she sat by the fire. "Miss Hayes," he began awkwardly, "me and Jesse been talking. We don't feel right taking wages for this drive, knowing how things stand with the ranch." Bridget looked up in surprise. "I can't ask you to work for nothing. You ain't asking, we're offering." Jesse joined them, nodding emphatically. "Your pa gave us our start when nobody else would hire green boys. Least we can do is help his daughter keep what's rightfully hers." Emotion tightened Bridget's throat. "Thank you," she managed. Later, as Hank and Jesse took the first watch, Matthew sat beside Bridget. "Good men," he observed. "Yes," she agreed. "My father had a talent for finding them." She glanced at him. "You would have liked him, I think. Tell me about him." So she did. For the first time since his death, Bridget spoke freely about her father, his stubbornness, his principles, his unwavering belief that hard work and honesty would prevail. She told Matthew about learning to ride before she could walk, about cattle roundups and harsh winters, about the books her father ordered from back east because he believed education mattered, even on the frontier. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Matthew said when she finally fell silent. "He was." Bridget stared into the fire. "But he trusted too easily. That's what got him in trouble with the bank in the first place. He loaned money to neighbors who never repaid him, extended credit at the worst times." "He believed in people," Matthew said gently. "That's not a failing." "It is when it costs you everything." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Is that why you don't smile much? Because you're afraid to trust? The question caught her off guard. I don't smile because there's little to smile about, she answered defensively. I don't believe that, Matthew said. I think you're afraid that if you allow yourself moments of happiness, you'll somehow be betraying his memory, or worse, making yourself vulnerable again. Bridget stood abruptly. You don't know me well enough to make such claims. Perhaps not, he conceded, but I'd like to. Their eyes met across the fire, and Bridget felt that strange flutter in her chest again. I should check on the cattle, she said, retreating into the darkness before he could respond. The following days brought challenges, a sudden thunderstorm that spooked the herd, a river crossing made dangerous by recent rains, and the constant worry about what awaited them in Cheyenne. Through it all, Matthew remained steady, his presence a constant that Bridget found herself relying on more than she cared to admit. One afternoon, as they rode side by side, Bridget caught Matthew watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Just thinking, he replied, about how much I admire you. His directness startled her. Most people would have given up by now, sold out to Burton, taken the easy path. I'm not most people, no, he agreed. You're certainly not. That evening, as they made camp, Jesse Sullivan approached with news that sent a chill through Bridget's heart. Riders coming, he reported, 6 of them moving fast. Matthew was on his feet instantly. Burton's men, can't tell yet, but they're coming from the north. They didn't have long to wait. 6 riders approached their camp, hands conspicuously near their weapons. Bridget recognized the lead man as Burton's foreman, a hard-faced individual named Pike. Evening, Miss Hayes, Pike called, reining his horse to a stop. Quite the expedition you've got yourself. What do you want, Pike? Bridget asked, stepping forward despite Matthew's warning hand on her arm. Mr. Burton sent me with a message. He's willing to be reasonable about that bank note. Says he'll give you an extra 30 days to come up with the money. How generous, Bridget replied coldly. And what does he want in return? Pike smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Just a small piece of your property, that north pasture with the year-round spring. Sign it over and you get your extension. That spring water's half my grazing land. Take it or leave it. Mr. Burton says it's more than fair, Matthew stepped forward, and if we refuse, Pike's eyes narrowed as he studied Matthew, don't believe we've been introduced, friend. We're not friends, Matthew replied evenly, and you haven't answered my question. If you refuse, Pike said, returning his attention to Bridget, Mr. Burton will enforce the terms of the loan. 30 days from the original notice, which by my count leaves you about 2 weeks. Bridget felt trapped. The north pasture was essential to her operation, but without more time, they might not make it to Cheyenne and back with enough money to pay off the loan. I need to think about it, she said finally. Pike nodded. Mr. Burton figured you might. We'll camp nearby tonight. He wants your answer by morning. As the riders departed, Matthew turned to Bridget. You can't give up that pasture? I know that, she snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. Sorry, I just need to think. Later, as the others slept, Bridget sat by the dying fire, turning over options in her mind. Matthew joined her, offering a cup of coffee. I've been doing some calculations, he said. If we push harder, travel longer each day, we could make Cheyenne in time to sell the cattle and get back before Burton's deadline. It's risky, Bridget mused. We'd be pushing the cattle too hard. They could lose condition, fetch lower prices. It's a risk, Matthew agreed, but better than giving up that pasture. Bridget studied him in the firelight. Why do you care so much, Matthew? This isn't your fight. He was quiet for a long moment. Maybe I've spent too much of my life walking away from fights that mattered. His eyes met hers. Or maybe I just can't stand the thought of seeing you lose something you love because of a man like Burton. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Matthew, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. Just know that whatever you decide, I'm with you. In that moment, Bridget realized how much she had come to depend on this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. His steadiness, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, these things had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. We'll push on, she decided. No deals with Burton. Matthew nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I was hoping you'd say that. When Pike returned in the morning, Bridget's answer was firm. Tell Mr. Burton I decline his offer. I'll meet the original terms of the loan. Pike's expression darkened. You're making a mistake, Miss Hayes. The mistake would be giving up what's rightfully mine. Good day, gentlemen. As Burton's men rode away, Matthew stood beside her. They won't take that well. Probably not, Bridget agreed. We'd best be on our guard. They broke camp quickly and pushed the herd harder than before. The days blurred together in a haze of dust and determination. They rose earlier, rested less, and drove the cattle until the last light faded from the sky. It was exhausting work, but Bridget found a strange exhilaration in the challenge. One evening, as they made a hasty camp, Bridget noticed Matthew wincing as he dismounted. You're hurt, she said, approaching him with concern. It's nothing, old injury acting up, but his grimace betrayed him. Let me see. Her tone brooked no argument. Reluctantly, Matthew removed his shirt, revealing a jagged scar that ran across his left shoulder and down his back. Bridget gasped softly. What happened? Bar fight in Dodge City, he said with a weak attempt at humor. You should see the other fellow, Matthew, he sighed. It happened during the war. I was with the Union Army. Confederate sharpshooter found me at Gettysburg. Bridget's fingers hovered over the scar. May I? At his nod, she gently touched the raised tissue. Does it still pain you often? Only when I overdo it, or when the weather's changing. You should have said something. We've been pushing too hard. Matthew caught her hand as she withdrew it. You're not responsible for my old wounds, Bridget. The warmth of his grip sent a current through her that had nothing to do with concern. Still, she murmured, we need you healthy. There was a question in his eyes that made her heart race. The ranch, she clarified, though even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. Matthew released her hand slowly, his fingertips trailing across her palm. Of course, he said, and she couldn't tell if the disappointment she heard was real or imagined. That night, Bridget lay awake, replaying the moment in her mind. The feel of his skin beneath her fingers, the intensity in his eyes, the unspoken questions that hung between them, it all swirled in her thoughts, making sleep impossible. She was falling in love with Matthew Blackwell. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange sense of clarity. For the first time since her father's death, she was thinking beyond mere survival. She was imagining a future. The next morning, as they prepared to move out, Jesse Sullivan rode in from scouting ahead. Trouble, he reported grimly. Burton's men are up ahead, about a dozen of them. They've set up a blockade at Rattlesnake Pass. The pass was the quickest route to Cheyenne. Going around would add days they couldn't afford. Options? Bridget asked, looking at Matthew. He considered for a moment. We could try to find another way through, but it would cost us time we don't have, or we could try to reason with them. Burton's men don't reason, Hank interjected. They understand only one language. Then perhaps we need to speak it, Matthew said grimly. They formulated a plan. Hank and Jesse would drive the cattle through the pass at dawn when visibility was poor. Meanwhile, Bridget and Matthew would create a diversion by approaching from the east, making enough noise to draw Burton's men away from their position. As they prepared, Bridget felt a growing sense of unease. This is dangerous, Matthew. Yes, he agreed simply. If anything happens to you, nothing will. He held her gaze. I'll be right beside you. Before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a brief, gentle kiss that was over almost before it began. For luck, he whispered. Bridget stood frozen, her lips tingling from the contact. 1,000 responses raced through her mind, but before she could choose one, Matthew had turned away to continue preparations. They moved out well before dawn, circling wide to approach the pass from the east. The plan was simple but risky: create enough noise to make Burton's men think the herd was coming from that direction, drawing them away from the actual path through the pass. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Bridget and Matthew began their diversion. They fired shots into the air, drove a small group of horses ahead of them, and generally created as much commotion as possible. It worked. Burton's men abandoned their position, blocking the pass, and rode toward the noise. By the time they realized they'd been tricked, Hank and Jesse had already driven the main herd through the pass and were well on their way to safety, but Bridget and Matthew weren't so fortunate. As they turned to escape, 3 riders cut them off. Pike was among them, his face twisted with anger. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled, drawing his gun. Matthew moved his horse subtly, positioning himself between Bridget and the threat. "We're just passing through," he said calmly. "No need for trouble. You made trouble when you defied Mr. Burton." Pike's gun was now pointed squarely at Matthew's chest. "I think it's time someone taught you both a lesson." What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. Matthew lunged forward, knocking Bridget from her saddle just as a shot rang out. They tumbled to the ground as more gunfire erupted above them. When Bridget raised her head, she saw Matthew lying motionless beside her, blood staining his shirt. Terror gripped her heart. "Matthew," she crawled to him, heedless of the bullets flying overhead, his eyes fluttered open. "Are you hurt?" he gasped. "No, but you just grazed me," he managed, though the growing bloodstains suggested otherwise. More shots rang out, but they weren't aimed at them. Hank and Jesse had doubled back, firing at Burton's men from the ridge above. Pike and his companions, outflanked and outnumbered, retreated reluctantly. "We need to move," Bridget urged, helping Matthew to his feet. He swayed dangerously, and she could feel the dampness of his blood seeping through her shirt as she supported him. With Hank and Jesse providing cover, they managed to reach their horses and escape through the pass. Only when they were miles away did they stop to properly assess Matthew's wound. It was worse than he'd admitted. A bullet had torn through his side, leaving an ugly gash that bled freely. Bridget cleaned and bandaged it as best she could with their limited supplies, her hands trembling with fear and something deeper. "You could have been killed," she said, voice breaking. "Why would you risk your life like that?" Matthew's face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear as they met hers. "You know why," and she did. The realization washed over her like a wave, threatening to sweep away the carefully constructed walls around her heart. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, avoiding the unspoken truth between them. They made it to Cheyenne 2 days later, Matthew growing weaker despite his protests that he was fine. While Hank and Jesse took the cattle to market, Bridget brought Matthew to the town doctor, who extracted the bullet and stitched the wound. "He'll live," the doctor assured her, "but he needs rest. No riding for at least a week." A week they didn't have. The deadline for Burton's loan was approaching rapidly. Even if the cattle sale went well, they would need to return to the ranch immediately to make the payment in time. Bridget sat beside Matthew's bed in the small room above the doctor's office, watching him sleep. The face that had become so dear to her was drawn with pain, even in unconsciousness. She reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. "I can't lose you too," she whispered, admitting aloud what she'd barely acknowledged to herself. His eyes opened slowly. "You won't," he promised, his voice rough with sleep and pain. "The doctor says you can't travel." "The doctor doesn't know what's at stake." Bridget shook her head. "The ranch isn't worth your life, Matthew," he caught her hand. "It's your home, your father's legacy, and—" He hesitated. "I hoped it might be my future too." The words hung between them, laden with meaning. Bridget felt tears prick her eyes. Matthew, a knock at the door interrupted them. Jesse entered, his expression triumphant. "We sold the cattle," he announced. "Got top dollar too. We have enough to pay off Burton's loan with some left over." Relief flooded through Bridget. "That's wonderful news." "But," Jesse continued, his smile fading, "we heard in town that Burton's hired more men. Word is they're watching the trails back to your ranch, planning to delay anyone trying to reach it before the deadline." The momentary elation evaporated. "How long do we have?" Bridget asked. 4 days. Matthew struggled to sit up. "We can make it if we leave now." "You're not going anywhere," Bridget said firmly. "The doctor was clear. If we wait, we lose everything," Matthew argued. "I won't let that happen." Their eyes locked in silent battle. Bridget knew he was right, but the thought of risking his life again terrified her. "There must be another way," she insisted. Jesse cleared his throat. "Actually, there might be. I met a fellow at the stockyards who works for the bank in Silver Creek. He's heading back tomorrow on the morning stage. If we entrust the money to him, no, Bridget and Matthew said simultaneously. I don't trust anyone connected to that bank, Bridget explained. They've been in Burton's pocket from the beginning. Then we ride, Matthew said, his determination evident in every line of his face. Together, in the end, they compromised. Hank would stay in Cheyenne to conclude their business while Bridget, Matthew, and Jesse would head back to the ranch immediately. They would travel light and fast, avoiding the main trails where Burton's men might be watching. The journey was grueling. Matthew, despite his injury, refused to slow their pace. Each night, Bridget redressed his wound, noticing with alarm how fever flushed his cheeks and pain lined his eyes. Yet each morning, he mounted his horse without complaint, his will seemingly stronger than his body. On the third day, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon, Bridget confronted him. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, checking his bandages. The wound showed signs of infection, the skin around it angry and hot. "We're almost there," Matthew replied, though his voice was weaker than she'd ever heard it. "Not if you kill yourself first." She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Matthew, please, the ranch isn't worth this." He caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his condition. "It's not just about the ranch anymore, Bridget. It's about us." "Us," she repeated, heart hammering. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first evening on your porch when you stood there with your rifle, looking like you could take on the world single-handed." Tears filled Bridget's eyes. "You don't even know me. I know you're the strongest, most stubborn, most beautiful woman I've ever met. I know you carry the weight of your father's legacy and everyone else's expectations without bending. I know you've been hurt and you're afraid to trust again." His thumb stroked her pulse point gently. "And I know that if you'd let me, I'd spend the rest of my days trying to make you smile." The words he'd spoken on that first day now carried a depth of meaning that overwhelmed her. Bridget leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, not a brief kiss like their first, but one filled with all the emotion she'd kept locked away. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "And that terrifies me more than losing the ranch ever could." "Why?" he asked softly. "Because now I have something else to lose." They reached the ranch with mere hours to spare before Burton's deadline. Walter greeted them with a mixture of relief and alarm. "Burton himself is at the bank," he reported. "Been there all morning, gloating about how he's finally going to get his hands on Hayes' land." Bridget helped Matthew dismount, alarmed at how heavily he leaned on her. His wound had worsened during the journey, and he could barely stand. "Get him inside," she instructed Jesse. "Walter, hitch the wagon, we're going to town." "You're not leaving me behind," Matthew protested weakly. "You can barely sit a horse," Bridget countered. "You need a doctor. What I need is to see the look on Burton's face when you pay that loan in full." Despite his condition, there was steel in his voice. "I'm coming with you, Bridget. End of discussion." They compromised again. Matthew would ride in the wagon with the money while Bridget drove. Jesse and Walter would follow on horseback, just in case Burton had any last tricks planned. The small town of Silver Creek was unusually busy when they arrived. News of the confrontation between Bridget Hayes and Maxwell Burton had spread, and locals gathered outside the bank, curious to see the outcome. Burton himself stood on the bank steps, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and an expensive suit. His expression shifted from smug satisfaction to disbelief as he watched Bridget help Matthew from the wagon. "Miss Hayes," he called, voice dripping with false concern. "We'd almost given up on you. The deadline is in." He made a show of checking his pocket watch, less than an hour. "Then we're right on time," Bridget replied, supporting Matthew as they approached. She could feel the heat of his fever through his shirt and knew he was running on sheer willpower. Inside the bank, the manager, a nervous man named Fleming, who had always been cordial to Bridget in the past, avoided her gaze. "Mr. Burton has the paperwork ready," he murmured, pushing documents across his desk. "And I have the payment," Bridget responded, placing a heavy sack of coins beside the papers. $2,000 as stipulated in the original loan agreement. Burton's face darkened. "Count it," he ordered Fleming. As the banker meticulously counted the money, Burton turned to Bridget. "This isn't over, Miss Hayes. There are other ways to acquire what I want." "Not today," Matthew said, his voice weak but resolute. Burton's eyes narrowed as he studied Matthew. "You look familiar, Cowboy. Have we met before?" "I doubt it," Matthew replied evenly. "I try to avoid your type." A dangerous smile spread across Burton's face. "Now I remember. You're that professor from back east who testified against my associates in the railroad land scandal." "Blackwell, wasn't it? I heard you'd run west with your tail between your legs." Bridget glanced at Matthew in confusion. This was clearly more than the investment troubles he'd mentioned. "Ancient history," Matthew said dismissively. "Not to some people," Burton replied. "There are men who'd pay handsomely to know where you disappeared to." Before Bridget could process this new information, Fleming cleared his throat. "The payment is correct," he announced. "The loan is satisfied in full." Burton's smile vanished. "This isn't over," he repeated, stalking from the bank. Outside, a small cheer went up from the townspeople who had been watching through the windows. Word spread quickly that Bridget Hayes had bested Maxwell Burton, and several people approached to offer congratulations. But Bridget barely heard them. Matthew had grown alarmingly pale, and as the tension of the confrontation faded, he swayed dangerously. "We need to get him to the doctor," she told Jesse urgently. The town's physician confirmed Bridget's fears infection had set in and Matthew's condition was serious. "He needs complete rest," the doctor warned, "and prayer wouldn't hurt." For 3 days, Bridget barely left Matthew's side. She bathed his fevered brow, coaxed medicine between his lips, and whispered encouragement when delirium took him. In his lucid moments, he apologized repeatedly for not telling her the full truth about his past. "I testified against corrupt railroad executives," he explained weakly. "Men who bribed officials, forged land titles, destroyed lives. Afterward there were threats. I had to disappear." "Why didn't you tell me?" Bridget asked, hurt mingling with concern. "At first, because I didn't know if I could trust you later." He hesitated, "Because I was afraid you'd send me away if you knew the danger I might bring to your door." "You risked everything for my ranch," she said softly. "How could I ever send you away?" On the 4th day, Matthew's fever broke. The doctor, checking his wound, nodded with satisfaction. "He's going to make it," he told Bridget. "The man has the constitution of an ox and apparently something worth living for." When they were alone again, Matthew reached for Bridget's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For fighting for me the way you fight for everything you love." The word love hung between them, filled with promise and possibility. Bridget, exhausted from days of worry, found herself smiling a real smile that reached her eyes and lifted the weight from her heart. "There it is," Matthew said softly, "the smile I've been working for." "Is it worth all this trouble?" she asked, gesturing to his bandaged side. "Worth every moment," he assured her, squeezing her hand, "though I hope earning the next one doesn't require a bullet wound." 2 weeks later, Matthew was strong enough to return to the ranch. The autumn air had turned crisp, golden leaves drifting from the cottonwoods along the creek. Sitting on the porch where they had first met, they watched the sunset paint the distant mountains purple and gold. "Burton won't give up," Bridget said, breaking a comfortable silence. "He'll find another way to come after the ranch." "Probably," Matthew agreed, "but we'll be ready." She turned to look at him. Matthew shifted in his chair to face her more fully. "I was hoping. That is, I wanted to ask." He paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I love you, Bridget Hayes. I want to build a life with you here on this land your father loved, if you'll have me." Bridget felt warmth spread through her chest, a happiness so intense it was almost painful. "Are you proposing, Mr. Blackwell?" "I believe I am, Miss Hayes." Rather clumsily, I'm afraid. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I love you too, Matthew, and yes, I'll have you clumsy proposals and all." His smile lit his eyes as he leaned forward to kiss her a kiss full of promise and the future they would build together. 6 months later, they were married in the small church in Silver Creek. The whole town turned out for the celebration, along with ranchers from miles around. Even Burton stayed away, perhaps recognizing that the Hayes Ranch, soon to be the Hayes Blackwell Ranch, was now protected by something stronger than legal documents or property lines. Walter, serving as Matthew's best man, wiped away tears as they exchanged vows. Hank and Jessie Sullivan whooped with joy when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. And Bridget, radiant in her mother's carefully preserved wedding dress, smiled more brilliantly than anyone had ever seen. That evening, as they danced under lantern light in the ranch yard, Matthew pulled his bride close. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "Good," he spun her in a circle that made her laugh. "Because I intend to keep that smile on your face for the rest of our days." "Is that a promise, Professor Blackwell?" "It's a guarantee, Mrs. Blackwell." As the years passed, the Hayes Blackwell Ranch flourished. Matthew's education and Bridget's practical knowledge proved a formidable combination. They expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and even opened a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, with Matthew teaching mathematics and Bridget instructing in practical ranching skills. Burton eventually sold his holdings and moved east, defeated not by force, but by the community that had rallied around the couple who had defied him. The railroad came through Silver Creek, bringing new opportunities and challenges that Bridget and Matthew faced together. They had children, first a son who inherited his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's determination, then twin daughters who grew up riding horses before they could properly walk. Family life suited them both, bringing a fullness and joy neither had dared hope for in those early, uncertain days. On their 10th anniversary, Matthew surprised Bridget with a small wooden box. Inside lay a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype Bridget standing on the porch of their ranch house, smiling broadly. Their children gathered around her. "To remind you," Matthew said softly, "of the promise I made and kept." Bridget touched the image with gentle fingers. "I don't need reminding," she said, looking up at the man who had changed her life with a simple, determined declaration on a moonlit porch so many years ago. "But I'll treasure it anyway." That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, Bridget reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate young woman facing ruin to the confident ranch owner and mother she had become. From a disgraced professor seeking anonymity to the respected teacher and rancher Matthew now was. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "About how different life would be if you hadn't ridden up that evening looking for work." "Providence," Matthew suggested, taking her hand, "or just good fortune," Bridget countered with a smile. "Either way," he said, lifting her fingers to his lips, "I'm grateful every day." As they sat together, their children sleeping soundly inside the house that had weathered so many storms, Bridget Hayes Blackwell realized that the greatest legacy her father had left her wasn't the ranch at all. It was the capacity to risk her heart again after loss, to build something new and beautiful from the ashes of what had been. And Matthew Blackwell, the man who had promised to make her smile, had given her so much more than momentary happiness. He had given her a partnership, a family, a future filled with both challenges and joy, a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream possible in the wild, beautiful land they both now called home.